Hello, everyone. Eddie Smith here with Matt Conley for Midwestern Marks. We wanted to come on and talk about the transition from feudalism into capitalism, how it took a long time, how it happened in spurts with various revolutions and various experiments before fully transitioning into capitalism. And, a lot of people have given up on socialism. You kind of have post-leftism becoming popular, and people are like, we'll never escape capital. But we've only had, capitalism's only been around since the 1700s, and we've had multiple revolutions and socialist experiments, multiple countries today who still are committed to building socialism. The left seems very pessimistic, but we like to be optimistic, and believe that we can keep fighting for socialism using similar techniques from the past, but also building on the mistakes of the past and looking to continue advocating for the overthrow of capitalism and all its contradictions. So I'm going to let Matt start out here, talk a little bit about feudalism and how it became capitalism and whatever else he wants to talk about. So go right ahead.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, Eddie. So first, I just wanted to do a quick history of feudalism and kind of its transition to capitalism. So feudalism was the dominant economic system for about 1,100 years in the West, in Europe specifically. And that lasted until about the 17th century when it was replaced by capitalism. Feudalism is basically where a king would grant land to lords or vassals, and then the vassals would have peasants work on their land, and the peasants would be able to take home a little bit of the grain or the food that they created, but most of it had to be sent upward to either the vassal or the king. These vassals also had their land protected by knights, so like a private security force essentially. And then, so that's basically feudalism in a nutshell. Feudalism collapsed for a lot of different reasons. First, there was a lot of internal wars, disputes over land, etc. And it was very inefficient compared to capitalism. So there was a growing demand for commodities and food that feudalism just simply could not keep up with. And especially with growing trade caused by things like the Crusade opening up to different markets, there had to be a new form of economics that feudalism could not keep up with demand. So that's how feudalism kind of fell and how capitalism came from that.
Yeah, you have situations like the French Revolution where the aristocracy is living in luxury. And that's where that quote, "let them eat cake," comes from. Is the people were rioting because they didn't have bread. And they told Marie Antoinette the people were coming to cut her head off because they didn't have bread. And she says, well, let them eat cake then, because these people were so disconnected from the plight of the workers and their subjects. So you have these workers' uprisings combined with these intellectual leaders like Rousseau and John Locke and others. And they're putting up these new ideals of rationality and secularism and saying, we as humans can think rationally and build a society based on positive ideals such as freedom, democracy, liberty. But when Marx comes along after capitalism has developed, and to be fair, a lot of these thinkers were at a time before capitalism had even developed into anything close to what it looks like today, or even anything close to what it would look like under Marx. And Marx says we cannot hold ourselves to these Enlightenment ideals, or we can't create a society that's congruent with these ideals of these thinkers because of the mode of production of capitalism. You need to understand how it works and how it grows. And that's essentially what Marx set out to do, to figure out how we could overthrow this system in the same way that feudalism was overthrown. You got any comment on that?
No, I do not. Keep going.
All right. So we'll talk a little bit about the rise of capitalism. So one other important thing to mention about feudalism was that the dominant religion at the time was Catholicism, and the clergy and the priests had a lot of power. And as capitalism started to emerge, Martin Luther was popularizing Protestantism and a move away from, going through the church to get to heaven, and all these different things that gave the church an excessive amount of power over people. And then after Martin Luther, you have Calvinism and John Calvin, and essentially, I'm not a religious scholar, a theological scholar, but what they'll tell you is that Calvin has been highly distorted just to fit capitalism. It's based on blind faith and free markets, and then expansion. We need to spread our religion, which fits perfectly with capitalism, a system based on growth, and a system which monopolizes into imperialism. So industry and manufacturing start to develop as feudalism is falling. So in medieval society, essentially you produce for your own consumption, and then you could produce enough for the feudal lords to live. And even under feudalism, the average person worked like 4 or 5 hours. And then you have some exchange that goes on through merchants when you have an excess of production. When people have more goods than they need to survive, they have this excess of goods, and you have merchants arrive to exchange those goods on a market, who eventually become capitalists. So as feudalism's falling, industry begins to transform into cooperative manufacturers and workshops with these merchants at the head. And the means of production are concentrated. So people start going into cities because you have these cooperative industries going on. You have the Industrial Revolution. And production has changed from you producing for yourself and for the feudal lord to you produce for this manufacturing industry. The capitalists become the owner of the means of production. These people who were formerly merchants are now at the head of these manufacturing workshops, and they are now turning the goods of labor, the goods that are taken from the earth, worked on by humans, and turned into something useful to exchange in a market, which in Marxist economics turns them into a commodity. Commodities are now being produced in these workshops, and capitalists are taking them to market and selling them. So now you have two classes that are emerged, the capitalists and the proletarians. You have a reserve army where some people are pushed out of production because they're not needed. And then when a worker dies or is fired, you can have someone who's unemployed take their spot. Unemployment is a function of capitalism. Any president bragging about low unemployment is a ding-dong. The only way to get rid of unemployment is to overthrow capitalism, and if we did, we could get rid of unemployment really easy. You have competition between capitalists as they start to kill each other off, which Matt is going to talk about in a contemporary context here in a second. And workers, now their only option to survive is to sell their labor to a capitalist for the means of subsistence, because feudalism is no more. All the land essentially is owned by the capitalists. The state is owned by the capitalists, and your only choice is to work for the capitalists. The legal framework becomes that of capitalism. The state is used to enforce private property ownership by the capitalists, whereas previously the feudal lord's army was essentially the state, which protected his land. Now the state protects the land of capitalists. And you have the contradiction of socialized production, everybody working together to produce the things we have, but individuals distributing those things and individuals selling those commodities on a market for absurd profits.
I also think it's interesting to note that the transition from feudalism to capitalism was also led by peasant revolts. So these peasant revolts overthrew the monarchies because the peasants basically realized that their labor was being exploited. They were working, creating all of this surplus grain, and then they were not seeing any of the fruits of their labor, and so they revolted. But instead of having the workers, the laborers own the means of production, instead the means of production were put into the hands of the capitalists, like Eddie said. So I think that's just one interesting thing, and I know on the left a lot of people talk about, is revolution the way to go or not? And I think it's also interesting because capitalists like to say that capitalism is all about peace, all about individual freedom, but that too did come from a revolution. And so I think that's interesting to look at with the history of capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, we celebrate the American Revolution here in America. It's really ironic, to have the revolutionaries, the people who want to take us forward to the next step, are demonized in America, a country founded on revolution where we celebrate, the 4th of July and our independence, which I'm not against. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing to celebrate, those who fought, those characters like John Brown who fought against slavery to change that mode of production to capitalism too. And you got to keep in mind, like, these thinkers like Rousseau, who wrote The Social Contract, and John Locke, and these liberal thinkers, and even Adam Smith and Ricardo, who Marx would build off, who Marx said were smart people, people, they weren't dealing with a developed capitalism yet, right? So that process I described where the means of production are concentrated and you now have socialized production with individuals selling those goods, that's not necessarily what all these Enlightenment thinkers were looking at, right? They were just looking at feudalism and saying, well, now we got rid of the monarchy, what next? They had no idea how capitalism was going to work and how it was going to monopolize itself. And do you want to talk about how monopolization happens in market production, and especially with how Amazon has done that, basically?
Yeah. So, interestingly enough, monopolization occurs within an economy. So let's say, for example, you have a potato chip company, and it has 500 competitors. And let's say one of these potato chip companies finds a new breed of potato that is produces more potato chips, so you're able to produce more bags and able to produce more bags for cheaper compared to your competitors. So then you're able to put more out to market, and because of that, you're able to sell it at a lower cost compared to your competitors, therefore undercutting your competitors and being able to make more profit because you're able to sell more than them. You'll be able to push these competitors out of the market until there are very few or no competitors left because you found this special breed of potato. And so now you can raise the prices as high as you want them to because you're the only company in the market. Similarly, today we see that with Amazon, where Amazon will look on their website, see what the best-selling product is, then make that same product themselves, then undercut the seller, therefore pushing that seller out of the market or forcing the seller to sell to Amazon. And then Amazon will reap the benefits either way by being able to jack up the price of their best-selling products. So monopolies can be created in this way. We also see that with internet service providers. We see that with healthcare. We see that with utilities, where if you have a special utility or a special market where nobody can really enter because of the high barriers to entry, you can either monopolize or oligopolize this industry, therefore being able to have force higher prices onto consumers and being able to make more money in the process.
Yeah, and I think you do a really good job of kind of, and you're not the theory nerd that I am, but I'm not as in tune with contemporary politics as you, is updating, though, using Marx's method to analyze contemporary capitalism. Because, Marx in Capital, after he lays out sort of the first 3 chapters, he just starts going through Europe and looking at what's going on, figuring out how these organizations, these capitalists are monopolizing themselves, how the system works, and it grows. But now we can look back and see how it's grown. And if you read Lenin's Imperialism, he basically says finance capital is what is monopolized and then goes abroad and causes imperialism, causes all these imperialist wars that, of course, is one of the main evils of the world today with the U.S. empire. And today, looking at it, using that same method that Marx and Lenin used, you essentially have the same thing. You have finance capital, so banks and industrial capitalists, people like oil oligarchs, or people like oil companies, stuff like that. Any company that takes resources out of the ground, has people labor on them, then sells them in a market. They've monopolized and they drive imperialism. But then the other huge sector is tech, and technology has changed the world. And that doesn't mean that Marxism is now wrong, now that capitalism is more symbolic and technological. That just means you have to update your analysis of it. So you have these giant tech companies like Amazon and even Walmart, I guess all these companies are online now, but Amazon, Facebook, all the tech giants, and they're monopolizing. Matt's showing me a picture right now of how much. You want to read that off?
Yeah. So I'm just showing Eddie this picture where about 8 companies own about 100 different sub-companies. And so we have Nestle, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, General Mills, Kellogg's, Mondelez, Mars, all of these different companies own about 100 companies in total. So the idea that you have freedom of choice within capitalism is just a false notion, because these companies are ultimately owned by only 8 companies who have basically oligopolized the market.
Yeah, so you have these. I guess it's in every industry, but tech is a big one, and now they're investing in housing, and And they're all tied to everything too. So like even these, the ones you were just showing me were mostly food production, and I'm sure they're tied into agriculture too. Everything is being monopolized, and you have to make that analysis and then I don't know, advocate for it being busted up, unionize those sectors. Like our buddy went into the railway union because he recognizes the power that union has, you know, if they go on strike, or even if they threaten strike, or if they, you know, just fight back against the company, they can even force the state, the government, to do a lot of things they want. And he thinks that's the path to quote-unquote revolution in the U.S. And yeah, so I guess my overall point with using Marx's method is look at the current state of capitalism, make a material analysis, and then do what you got to do to do class struggle, right? It's not going to be violent revolution. We're not going to have a guerrilla war. We'd all get killed by drones. But we can unionize, you know, and we can advocate for the breakup of these tech companies. And and my last point was, it's not that, you know, we don't want these engineers who work for Tesla or these genius people in Silicon Valley, these incredible programmers. It's not like we want to put them out on the streets. No, we want them to be in charge of production. We want not Zuckerberg and Bezos at the head of these ingenious tech people who only work for these goofballs because they have capital, because they've, you know, stomped on people's heads to get themselves to the top of these companies, and now they have hedge funds who just gamble on the stock market to maximize their profits. We want the engineers and the programmers to be in charge of what's produced because they're geniuses, and if the means of production are owned in common, we can have geniuses producing what's good for all of humanity rather than what's good for Daddy Bezos and Daddy Zuckerberg.
Yeah, so going back to that picture with the 7 or 8 companies, there's no way that another company can come into that market and compete. These companies just have too much power, too much capital, and like you were saying, the only way for these companies to be broken up is either through governmental regulations or increased worker power or unionization. And then that kind of ties back to the overall theme of this video, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and then hopefully inevitably socialism. Richard Wolff, Professor Richard Wolff from University of Massachusetts Amherst, has a great analysis of this, where basically he says that a long time ago our ancestors saw that there were monarchies, right? They were ruling over all of these people, and basically they had a divine right to rule. It was their natural place. That's what everybody believed. But then these liberal thinkers, as Eddie's been mentioning throughout the video, have or push the idea of democracy, right? Like, we can self-govern. We don't have to be ruled by one person who has a quote-unquote God right to rule. And so they created liberal democracies, which allowed people to have a say in their government, at least hypothetically. And the same should go for the workplace, right? Right now, the way it is you basically have a king working the workplace. The workers have no say in their working conditions. They have no say in how the profits are distributed. And what we see is, you know, increasing worker power. We want people to have a say in their workplaces. We want them to have a say in what to do with the profits of the labor, the value that they create. And so basically expanding democracy to all places of life, continue the cycle from monarchy to democracy, and finish that off.
Yeah, it's like Lenin says in State and Rev, you can't have democracy if you have capitalism, because the capitalists are going to make it really hard for poor people to vote. They're going to make it hard to gain suffrage, and then and even if you gain suffrage, they still own the press. And now, you know, certain countries have a facade of democracy, and they have more worker organizations, like in Germany, so workers can force the government to do stuff. But if you look at the U.S. and you don't think that the state is just a tool for the rich, then you're insane. So what was feudalism? Feudalism was a mode of production where you had kings who owned the army, and then you had like merchants, and then everyone else worked. Now you just have these merchants, you know, I say that in quotes because they're capitalists now, who just own everything. They own the state, they own the army, they own your house, they own the banks, they own everything. And as we're saying, they're manufacturing monopolies. So they're gaming the markets, you know, whoever can get the cheapest natural resources and labor. And they're monopolizing their power, and it's almost like we're going back to feudalism. It's a pretty dialectical argument, you know. the new societies, our society today is not in a vacuum. It didn't come from a vacuum. It came from the American Revolution, where we had slavery alongside capitalism, and then slavery was overthrown, and now we have capitalism. And this is what capitalism develops itself into. And the U.S. is the place where the most private capital has concentrated, and you see the results. It's a murderous dictatorship where some of the workers live a lot better than people in the global south, but it's only at the expense of those people. And capitalism's grown into a global system too now. We can talk about that too. It continues to change and develop, but it still shows like the birthmarks of feudalism, and sometimes it seems like we're going to go backwards before we're able to move forward to anything better.
Right, just as the kings had a monopoly over the land that they ruled over, they basically had a say in, who got what land. They directed the land to the vassals that they had favor with and took it away from those that they didn't. Similarly, especially with the monopolies and the oligopolies that we see within the United States, it's basically the same thing where these few companies control almost the entirety of our country, giving the workers very little power, very little say in their treatment as workers. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I forgot. Dang it. I forgot.
That's all right. I don't know. Is there anything else that I guess we could talk about contemporary capitalism a little bit? Like, people criticize, we were talking about this, China's One Belt Road policy, and we were talking about how, you could label it as imperialism because there's, especially in certain countries, areas where China is, getting involved with that country's politics and being coercive in various ways. And it's always hard to know because you got to realize how propagandized the U.S. is and that a lot of media sources aren't publishing the truth. But, China's offering capital to these countries who are underdeveloped. And on its face value, looking at things in a vacuum, that seems like imperialism, right? It's the same as like the IMF and the World Bank structural adjustment loans. But if you take into context that a lot of these countries have been held in poverty by structural adjustment loans from the IMF and the World Bank for so long, it makes sense that China would want to offer them some capital. So my point is, like, capitalism has changed and evolved, and there's various ways to interpret the system and look to build a way around it. And China's looking at what the Soviet Union did with trying to arm up these countries and have an arms race and developing their military. I think 20 or 30% of their spending was military spending in the Soviet Union. And going into the Cold War, China's saying, no, we'll just fight sort of an economic war. We'll offer these countries capital to develop themselves, and then they'll be allied with us against the U.S. because the U.S. has been holding them in poverty. Is that imperialism? I guess. It's sort of like counter-imperialism, though, to the U.S. It's a little bit of a tangent, but I guess it's a podcast, so we can go on as long as we want. But
I also remembered what I was going to say. So
yes.
Going back to also the fact that capitalism is almost appearing like feudalism, I see capitalism keeps trying to privatize everything. So even capitalist states who have strong social welfare programs, like Scandinavia, are constantly at odds. The parties within those countries keep trying to either strengthen or cut these social safety net programs, but ultimately cuts are winning. And so in the past couple decades in some Scandinavian countries, you've seen a reduction in the strength of these social programs. And so capitalism is always pushing to privatize. ANCAPs like that. Anarcho-capitalists want to see basically fully privatized everything.
Down with the NHS.
Exactly. And I know a lot of people in their dream capitalist state, want to see private armies and private police forces. Who do you think can employ these private police forces? The people who have money, the people who have capital, kind of like the kings who had knights, or the lords who had knights because they held power. That's basically where I see, especially if capitalism keeps on privatizing, that's where I see it going, is basically neo-feudalism, where those who have power, those who have wealth, can control the system even more than they do already.
Yeah, it's like all this we've been talking about using the method of analyzing capitalism's development through feudalism. It's like ANCAPs gave up on that after the 1800s, they're like, nope, that's too hard. I'm just going to say everything's the government's fault, and we should go back to living in, like, the Wild West. And everyone can just mutually exchange stuff, and also child labor was justified at the time. That's the whole ANCAP ideology. Yeah, it's just, like, an inability to understand how competition between capitalists work and how monopolization works. And of course it's an inability to understand how the state functions, but we don't need to give ANCAPs any more of our time, right. I don't think.
I just think it's an intellectually dishonest position. Like, I think we can agree that, capitalism is preferable to feudalism. It did have its advantages. It made the system more efficient, but now we want to go further. We don't want to reduce back. We don't want to take government out. We see where liberal democracies have gotten us to this point. We want to go further. We want to expand democracy to all places. And not just give up halfway through, kind of like you were saying with ANCAPs. So.
Right, yeah, and people, they call it being radical, being radicalized. It's really not that radical, because the system that's developed, as I was talking about when we were explaining its development, you have socialized production. So people used to work on their own, Now people work together, and you have division of labor, where people work on an assembly line. And we praise Henry Ford, like, oh, you invented the assembly line. Who cares, what that does to a worker who has to work a screwdriver all day for 10 hours and nothing else, or go starve. But you have the division of labor. What was I talking about? Where did I start here? Hold on. But anyways, you have socialized cooperative production, but the distribution and the person who gets those socialized commodities is just a guy, or more realistically, a board, in modern terms of people. Or actually, as our buddy, again, mentioning our buddy who works on the railroad, has pointed out, you have sort of a new class dynamic now where managers essentially run the workplace and industry while boards and shareholders and whoever else collect most of the profits. So you have this professional managerial class that's risen to prominence in the U.S. Again, here talking about how capitalism develops and changes. It's not a static system, and we got to understand how to fight it in its contemporary form. Got anything else to add, Matt, or should we wrap it up here?
I think that's good. I think we did a good job.
Yes, we are geniuses.
Yeah,
smart. I'm going to write Capital Volume 4 now in the hour I have before work. So, thank you for joining us, Matt. Please plug yourself. Where should people follow you?
You can follow me on TikTok at Matt M. Conley, and that's about it. Follow Midwestern Marks, though.
Yes,
Subscribe.
Matt is connected with Midwestern Marks. He's helping us out all the time. Follow him on TikTok. Eventually building up grassroots organizing here in Iowa. Maybe run for office soon. But either way, great stuff happening. All right. Peace out, everyone.